the fire's going again tonight. Same wood, same spot, same dark all around. You're back, or maybe you're someone else. Doesn't matter much either way. There was a day once that I remember, even though nothing happened. Nothing that would make it worth remembering if you asked me to explain why I remember it. This was years ago, when I was working at a printing press, one of those jobs where you do the same thing over and over, feeding paper into machines, checking that everything's aligned right, pulling out the finished sheets and stacking them, then starting over again with the next batch. The place was loud, always loud, the sound of the presses running constant and heavy, a sound that got into your head and stayed there even after you left at the end of the day, even when you were trying to sleep at night. You'd hear it in your dreams sometimes, that rhythmic thumping and worry. The mechanical breathing of the machines that never stopped as long as there was work to do. I'd been working there for a few months, maybe half a year, long enough that I knew the routine and didn't have to think about it much. Could do the work while my mind wandered to other things. The other people who worked there, we didn't talk much during the day because of the noise, couldn't really hear each other, even if we tried. So mostly we just worked in our own worlds, side by side, but separate, doing our jobs and waiting for breaks or the end of the shift when we could hear again. There was a man who worked the press next to mine. Older guy, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He'd been there longer than anyone, knew the machines better than the people who'd built them probably, could fix problems that stumped everyone else, could keep things running when they should have broken down. His name was something common, John or Jim or Joe, one of those names you hear so often it stops meaning anything specific. We'd nod to each other when we arrived in the morning, nod again when we left at night, and that was about it for our interaction most days. Sometimes during breaks, we'd be in the same room, sitting at different tables, eating our lunches or drinking coffee. And we might exchange a word or two about the work or the weather, but nothing more than that, nothing that would count as a real conversation. The day I'm thinking about was ordinary in every way. I got up at the usual time, walked to work the usual route, arrived right when I always arrived, maybe a minute or two early or late, but not enough to matter. I clocked in, went to my press, started the day's work. The machines started up, the noise began, and I fell into the rhythm of it. The feeding and checking and stacking, the same motions repeated thousands of times until they became automatic, until my hands knew what to do without my brain needing to tell them. The man at the next press was there too, doing his work the same as always, and I was aware of him in that peripheral way you re-aware of things that are always there, like furniture or walls or the floor under your feet. He was part of the landscape of that place, part of what made it familiar, and I didn't think about him consciously. Didn't pay attention to what he was doing, just knew he was there, the way you know things without having to verify them. The morning passed the way mornings did. Hours of work broken up by a 15-minute break mid-morning when we'd turn off the presses, and the sudden silence would feel strange and loud in its own way, louder almost than the noise had been. I'd go to the break room and get coffee from the machine there, coffee that was always too weak or too strong, but never just right. And I'd drink it, standing by the window, looking out at the parking lot and the street beyond, not thinking about anything in particular, just resting my mind the way you rest your body. The man would be in the break room too, usually sitting at one of the tables with his own coffee, and sometimes I'd catch his eye and we'd nod, that same small acknowledgement we'd give each other a dozen times a day without thinking about it. And then the break would end and we'd go back to our presses, and the noise would start again and the work would continue. Lunch was the same, a half hour when we could leave the building if we wanted, or stay in the break room if we preferred. I usually stayed, ate whatever I'd brought from home, usually a sandwich and an apple or an orange, something simple that didn't require much thought or preparation. The man ate at the same table every day, always alone, and he brought his lunch too, always in the same metal lunchbox that looked like it had been with him for decades, dented and scratched, but still functional. I never sat with him, never thought about sitting with him, just found my own spot and ate my own lunch and let my mind rest during that half hour before going back to the noise and the work. And he did the same, ate his lunch and read a newspaper sometimes, or just sat there, looking at nothing. And then we'd both finish around the same time and go back to our presses and start the afternoon shift. The afternoon was longer than the morning, or felt longer anyway. The same work, but with the weight of the day already on you, the tiredness starting to accumulate in your muscles and your mind. Another break mid-afternoon, the same routine, coffee and silence, and the parking lot out the window. And then the final stretch, the last couple of hours before the shift ended, the last batches of paper to run through the machines, the last sheets to stack. I remember looking over at the man at one point that afternoon, not for any particular reason, just looking up from my work for a second and seeing him there at his press, his hands moving with the same steady rhythm they'd been moving with all day, all week, all the years he'd been doing this work. And I thought, without really thinking it consciously, just had this awareness that he was always there, that he was part of the constancy of that place, that he'd probably be there tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, as reliable as the sunrise, as predictable as the machines we worked. And then the shift ended, the machines wound down, the noise stopped, and we cleaned up our stations and put away the tools and materials and got ready to leave. The man was still there when I finished, still doing his end-day routine, wiping down his press, checking things over one last time, making sure everything was ready for the next day. I walked past him on my way out, and we nodded to each other. The same nod we'd exchanged in the morning, meaningless and meaningful at the same time. I left the building and walked home the same route I always walked, and the day was ending the way days end. The light fading, the air cooling, people heading home from work, cars passing, life continuing in its usual way. I got home and made dinner and ate and cleaned up and sat for a while before going to bed. And the whole time I wasn't thinking about the day particularly, wasn't thinking about work or the man at the next press or anything specific, just letting my mind be quiet after the noise and the work. And then I went to bed and slept and got up the next morning and did it all again. And that day I'm remembering that ordinary day when nothing happened. It disappeared into the stream of all the other days just like it. It became indistinguishable from them, became part of the undifferentiated mass of time that makes up most of a life. But then something changed, broke the pattern, made that day suddenly separate from all the others. The man didn't come to work the next day, or the day after that, and after about a week, someone mentioned he'd died, had a heart attack at home, sudden and unexpected, and that was it. He was gone. They hired someone else to work his press, a younger man who didn't know the machines as well, and had to ask questions and make mistakes and learn the way everyone has to learn. And I realized then that I missed the presence of the man who'd been there, missed seeing him at his press, missed the nods we'd exchange, missed knowing he was there even when I wasn't looking at him or thinking about him. And I thought back to that last ordinary day, that day when I'd looked over and seen him working, and thought about how he was always there, and I realized that had been the last time, that I hadn't known it was the last time, hadn't known that ordinary day was actually the last ordinary day, the last day of a routine that had seemed like it would go on forever, but had actually been about to end. And the absence of him changed that day retroactively, made it memorable, made it stand out from all the other days just like it. Not because anything had happened that day, but because nothing had happened, because it had been normal and ordinary and unremarkable, and those qualities became precious once they were gone. Once I understood that normal and ordinary and unremarkable were things that could disappear, that did disappear, that should be noticed and appreciated, while they re-happening because you never know when they'll be taken away. I kept working at that printing press for a while after he died, and every day I'd see the new man at what used to be his press, and every day I'd feel the absence, feel the shape of something that wasn't there anymore, something that had been so constant and reliable that I'd stopped noticing it was there until it wasn't. And I'd think about that last ordinary day, about seeing him at his press, about the nod we'd exchanged when I left, about how I hadn't known it was goodbye, hadn't known to pay attention, hadn't known that ordinary moments were actually the important ones, the ones worth holding on to. Eventually, I left that job, moved on to other work, and the memory of that man and that ordinary day faded somewhat, got buried under new memories and new experiences. But it never disappeared entirely, never stopped being something I thought about sometimes. Usually when I was doing routine things, usual things, ordinary things that felt like they'd always be there. And I'd remember to notice them, remember to be aware that this moment, this ordinary moment, might be the last one, might be the one I'll remember later, when the routine is broken and the ordinary has become extraordinary through its absence. I had a routine once that lasted for years, a way of moving through days that became so familiar it felt like it was the only way days could be, like it was a law of nature rather than a temporary arrangement that could change or end at any time. This was when I was living in a town, working at a warehouse, one of those jobs where you load and unload trucks, move boxes and crates from one place to another, simple physical work that didn't require much thinking, but required a lot of time and a lot of effort. The warehouse was on the edge of town, about a half-hour walk from where I lived, and I'd walk there every morning and walk back every evening. The same route both times, down residential streets, and then along a road that had some businesses, and then past some empty lots, and finally to the warehouse. I'd make that walk 5 days a week, sometimes 6 if they needed extra help on Saturday. And I did it in all weather, rain or shine or snow or heat, just walking with my hands in my pockets or my lunch in a bag, not thinking about much, just moving. There was a woman who walked the same route I walked, or part of it anyway, and I started noticing her after a few weeks of working that job. Started seeing her regularly enough that her presence became part of my routine, part of what I expected when I walked that route. She'd be ahead of me, usually, walking in the same direction, and I'd see her from a distance and know it was her from the way she walked, or the coat she wore, or just some quality I could unname but recognized anyway. She worked somewhere along that route, I figured some business or office in the same general area as the warehouse. And her schedule must have been similar to mine, because we'd be walking at the same time, leaving around the same hour in the morning, heading home around the same time in the evening. I never caught up to her, never walked fast enough to close the distance between us, just kept my pace, and she kept hers, and we moved through space in parallel, separate but connected by the route and the timing and the routine we both followed. Sometimes I'd see her in the evening too, walking back, and we'd be going the same direction again. Her ahead of me usually, but sometimes behind if my shift ended earlier or later than usual. And over time I started to recognize her more specifically, not just as a figure on the route, but as a person, a woman probably in her 30s or 40s, with dark hair she wore pulled back, a blue coat she wore in cold weather, a bag she carried over her shoulder that looked heavy and full. We never spoke, never even acknowledged each other that I remember. No nods or smiles or any indication that we were aware of being part of the same routine. Maybe she didn't notice me at all, or maybe she did but didn't think anything of it. Just another person walking the same route, nothing remarkable or worth paying attention to. And I didn't try to make contact, didn't try to catch up or say hello or establish any kind of relationship. Just let her be there in her own world while I stayed in mine. But I was aware of her, noticed when she was there and noticed when she wasn't. Noticed when her schedule shifted and I'd see her at a different time or not at all. And her presence became part of how I oriented myself during those walks. Part of how I measured time and distance. If I saw her, I knew I was on schedule. Knew I was where I should be at the time I should be there. And if I didn't see her, something felt off, felt like the day was out of alignment somehow. The route we walked took us through different kinds of neighborhoods, some nice with well-kept houses and yards, some less nice with buildings that needed repair and yards full of junk and cars that did run. And then the businesses, small shops and offices, a diner that was always busy in the morning, a gas station, a place that sold used furniture. Random things that you notice when you walk the same route every day but do unreally think about. Just landmarks that mark progress, that tell you how far you've come and how far you have left to go. There was a stretch where the road had trees on both sides, old trees that made a kind of tunnel in summer, when they were full of leaves, and I liked that stretch, looked forward to it during the walk because it felt different from the rest, felt separate somehow, like passing through it, took you from one world to another. And I'd see the woman walking through that tree tunnel ahead of me, sometimes see her figure dappled with light and shadow. And there was something about it that felt peaceful, that made me glad we were both there at that moment, moving through that space together, even though we were alone. Winter came, and the trees lost their leaves, and the walk got colder and harder. Ice on the sidewalks sometimes, wind that cut through your coat no matter how many layers you wore. And still we both kept walking, kept following our routine, her ahead of me in the morning, sometimes behind me in the evening, both of us bundled up and moving quickly because standing still in that cold wasn't an option. I remember one morning it was snowing, coming down steady and thick, and visibility was poor. Couldn't see very far ahead, and I was walking my usual route, and I saw her up ahead, like always, walking through the snow, and I thought about how we were both out there in that weather, both doing what we had to do, both following the routine because that's what you did, that's what life required. You didn't get to stop just because the weather was bad, or you were tired, or you didn't feel like it. And there was something comforting in that, in knowing someone else was out there doing the same thing, facing the same conditions, keeping going the same way I was keeping going. Not that we were together or that we were helping each other, just that we were both there, both part of the same pattern, both proof that life continued, even when it was difficult, that routines persisted even when they were hard to maintain. Spring came eventually, and the weather warmed up, and the walk became easier again, became pleasant even, something to enjoy rather than something to endure. The trees leafed out and made their tunnel again, and the woman was still there on the route, still walking at the same time, still ahead of me in the morning, and the routine continued the way it had for months, steady and unchanging and reliable. I worked at that warehouse for almost 2 years, and for most of that time, the woman was part of my walk, part of my routine, part of the structure of my days. And then one day she wasn't there, and the next day she wasn't there either. And after about a week of not seeing her, I realized she must have changed jobs, or moved, or something had happened that broke her routine the way my routine would eventually be broken. And I missed her, missed seeing her on the route, missed that sense of parallel movement, of shared routine, even though it had never been acknowledged or discussed or made explicit. The walk felt different without her there, felt emptier somehow, like something had been removed that I hadn't known was important until it was gone. I kept working at the warehouse for a few more months after she stopped appearing on the route, and I kept walking the same way, past the houses and the businesses and through the tree tunnel. But it wasn't the same. Something had changed. The pattern had been disrupted and couldn't be restored. And after a while, I left that job too, found work somewhere else that required a different route, a different routine, and I stopped walking that way entirely. But I think about it sometimes, about those walks and that routine and that woman who was part of it, without knowing she was part of it, without us ever speaking or acknowledging each other or establishing any kind of connection beyond the accidental one of timing and geography. And I think about how much of life is like that. These parallel routines we follow alongside other people. These shared patterns that connect us without our knowledge or consent or awareness. These invisible threads that tie us to strangers we see every day but never really know. And I think about how fragile those connections are, how easily they break, how one person changes their schedule, or moves away, or dies, and suddenly the pattern is disrupted, and the routine is broken, and you re-left with the absence of something you didn't know you valued until it wasn't there anymore. And you can't get it back, can't restore what was lost, can just remember it and be grateful you had it for as long as you did, even if you didn't appreciate it at the time, even if you didn't notice it was something worth appreciating. There was a man I worked with once who did the same thing every day at the same time, a small thing barely worth noticing. Something I only noticed because I was there to see it, and because it happened so regularly, it became impossible not to notice. This was at a different job, a factory that made furniture, tables and chairs and cabinets, simple, solid pieces that were built to last. The work was assembly mostly, putting pieces together, attaching hardware, finishing surfaces, checking quality, then moving everything along to the next stage. The man worked at the station next to mine, on the line, doing the same kind of work I did, and we'd been working side by side for months, maybe close to a year, long enough that we developed that comfortable silence that comes when you work with someone regularly and don't need to fill every moment with conversation. We'd talk sometimes during breaks or when something unusual happened that needed discussing. But most of the time we just worked, each focused on our own tasks, moving through the day in parallel. He was probably in his 40s, this man, average height, average built, nothing about him that stood out particularly, just a regular person doing regular work. The kind of person you'd see every day and never remember if something about them did uncatch your attention and make them memorable. And what caught my attention, what made him memorable, was this thing he did every single day at exactly the same time, around 3 in the afternoon, when we'd been working for several hours and still had several hours to go, when the day was starting to drag and everyone was getting tired and ready for the shift to end. He'd stop working for a moment and reach into his pocket and pull out a piece of candy. Always the same kind of candy, those hard butterscotch ones that come wrapped in yellow cellophane, and he'd unwrap it, carefully, methodically smoothing out the wrapper and folding it into a small square that he'd put back in his pocket. Then he'd pop the candy in his mouth and go back to work. And for the next 10 or 15 minutes, while the candy lasted, he'd work with it in his mouth, moving it from one side to the other occasionally. And you could tell he was enjoying it, even though his expression didn't change, even though he didn't smile or show any obvious sign of pleasure. It was just there in the way he moved, a slight loosening, a subtle relaxation, like that small sweetness was enough to make the rest of the afternoon bearable. He did this every single day. 3 o'clock, butterscotch candy, the careful unwrapping and folding of the wrapper, the candy in his mouth while he worked. And after I noticed it the first few times, I started expecting it, started checking the clock around 3 to see if he'd do it, and he always did, never missed, never varied, as reliable as anything else in that factory, as predictable as the machines, or the schedule, or the way the light came through the windows at certain times of day. I never asked him about it, never mentioned that I'd noticed, never said anything that would acknowledge this small ritual he performed every day. It felt private somehow, even though he did it right there in front of everyone. Felt like something that was his and shouldn't be commented on or questioned or made into something it wasn't. It was just what he did, part of who he was, a small piece of his routine that helped him get through the day. Sometimes I'd catch other people noticing it, to see them glance over at 3 o'clock. When he reached for his pocket, see the small smiles they'd tried to hide, but nobody ever said anything. Everybody just let him have his candy and his moment and his small daily pleasure. And there was something nice about that, about the way we all silently agreed to let this thing be what it was, to not make a joke of it, or tease him about it, or do anything that might make him self-conscious, or cause him to stop. The candy became a marker for me, a way to know what time it was without checking the clock, a way to measure how much of the day was left. When he reached for his pocket, I'd know we were past the midpoint of the afternoon. Know we'd made it through the hardest part. Know there were just a few more hours to go before we could go home. And in a strange way, his candy made my day easier too, gave me something to look forward to, or at least something to notice, a small point of interest in the monotony of the work. I worked at that factory for about 1.5 years, and the whole time I was there, the man had his 3 o'clock candy, never missed, as far as I know, never changed the time or the type of candy or the ritual of unwrapping and folding. It was constant, reliable, something you could count on in a world where most things weren't constant or reliable or countable upon. And then I left, took a different job, and I didn't think much about the man or his candy after I left, just filed it away as one of those small details from a job I used to have, one of those things you remember if something reminds you, but otherwise don't think about because there's no reason to. But then years later, I was in a store and I saw those butterscotch candies, the same kind he used to have, in their yellow wrappers, sitting there on a shelf. And suddenly I was back in that factory, back at my station on the line, watching him reach into his pocket at 3 o'clock, watching him unwrap the candy with that same careful attention, watching him fold the wrapper into a small square, and I felt something, not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, some awareness of time passing and things changing and the impossibility of going back. I bought a bag of the candies, even though I didn't particularly like butterscotch, didn't really eat candy at all, usually. I took them home and opened the bag and took one out and unwrapped it, and the wrapper made the same crinkling sound it had made when he unwrapped his candies, and the smell was the same, that sweet, artificial butterscotch smell, and I put the candy in my mouth, and it tasted exactly like I remembered, too sweet and too artificial, but not unpleasant, just very specifically what it was. And I thought about him, about whether he still worked at that factory, still had his 3 o'clock candy, still followed that small ritual that had helped him get through his days. Or maybe he'd moved on to, found a different job, maybe didn't need the candy anymore, or had found some other small pleasure to mark his afternoons. Or maybe something had happened. Maybe he was sick, or injured, or dead. Maybe that routine I'd witnessed for 1.5 years had ended shortly after I left, or long before now. I'd never know, would never find out what happened to him, or whether he remembered me, or even noticed me the way I noticed him. We worked side by side for all that time, and we been friendly enough, but we were friends. Didn't exchange information about our lives outside the factory, didn't make plans to stay in touch when I left. He was just someone I worked with, someone whose candy ritual I happened to witness. And I was just someone who worked next to him, someone who was there and then wasn't. But that small thing, that daily candy, it stayed with me, became something I thought about when I needed a reminder that people have their own private ways of coping, their own small rituals and comforts that help them survive the difficult or boring or painful parts of life. And those rituals matter, even if they seem trivial to others, even if they're just a piece of candy at 3 o'clock, even if they're so small and quiet that most people don't notice them at all. I still have that bag of candies somewhere, probably stale by now, probably should throw them away, but I haven't. Keep them in a drawer or a cabinet. Don't eat them, but don't get rid of them either. And every once in a while, I'll come across them, and I'll take one out and look at it, at the yellow wrapper. And I'll think about that man and his 3 o'clock ritual and the year and a half I spent working next to him, watching him do this small thing that gave him comfort or pleasure or just a moment's break from the monotony. And I'm grateful I got to see it. Grateful I was there to witness this small piece of someone's life, this tiny ritual that probably no one else remembers or thinks about or even noticed in the first place. It wasn't important in any objective sense, didn't change anything or affect anything or matter to anyone except maybe him. But it was real. It happened. It was part of how he lived his life. And the fact that I saw it and remembered it means something, means he wasn't entirely alone in it, means someone noticed and cared enough to hold on to the memory. That's what we do, I think. Hold these small memories of other people, these tiny observations and moments that seem meaningless at the time, but accumulate into something larger, into a sense of having been present in the world, of having shared space and time with other people, even if we never really connected with them, even if we never knew their full stories or understood their lives beyond the small pieces we witnessed. The man with his butterscotch candy, the woman on the morning walk, the coworker at the printing press who died and left an absence where his presence had been. These people shaped my life in ways they never knew, in ways I didn't understand until later, until I had time and distance and perspective to see how the small things are actually the large things, how the ordinary moments are the ones that matter most, how the routines and rituals and daily patterns we follow are what make us who we are. The fire's almost gone now, just a few coals left glowing in the dark. It's late, very late, and I've been talking for a long time, letting these memories come up and letting them flow out into words, into the night air, into the space between us. And maybe some of what I've said makes sense, and maybe some of it doesn't. Maybe some of it matters, and maybe none of it matters. But it's what I have, these stories, these fragments, these small pieces of a life lived alongside other lives, connected and separate, together and alone. The night's quiet now, except for the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a settling coal. Cold's coming in as the fire dies, cold that reminds you winter's always waiting, always ready to return, even when spring seems like it's here to stay. But that's all right. That's how it should be, the cycle continuing, things ending and beginning and ending again, the pattern repeating the way patterns do. If you want to sit here again tomorrow night, I'll probably be here. The fire's usually lit around this time. There's always room.